My name is Claire Donovan, and at 32, I never thought my own parents would drag me into court. Yet one night, standing in my kitchen, I froze as I read the stamped seal on the papers a courier had just delivered. The plaintiff wasn't a bank and employer or a stranger. It was my mother and father. They were suing me to force the sale of the apartment I had bled years to buy, an apartment in downtown Chicago that symbolized my independence because my younger sister needed money for her messy divorce. You'd think that kind of plot belonged in a primetime drama, not in real life. But there I was, staring at the words, my chest tightening, trying to take in that my parents wanted to strip away the one thing I had built entirely on my own. It felt like the walls I painted myself were closing in the floor beneath me, ready to give way. To understand why this moment was so devastating, you have to know what went into that apartment. It wasn't just real estate. It was 5 years of sacrifice, 60-hour weeks, skipped vacations, dollar store meals, secondhand furniture, all so that I could one day hold the keys to a place that was mine. Every tile I laid, every wall I painted had carried me through a childhood of being overlooked and into adulthood, where I finally had something to call my own. And yet with one legal motion, my parents were telling me none of that mattered, that my life's work should be liquidated to rescue the sister they always favored. I stood in silence, the buzzing of the refrigerator the only sound in the kitchen. Anger, betrayal, and an odd clarity washed over me all at once. This wasn't just about money. It was about roles that had been assigned long ago. My sister, the golden child who could stumble and always land on a cushion, and me, the responsible one, the safety net they could exploit whenever Brittany's world fell apart. This lawsuit was simply the ugliest confirmation of a pattern that had ruled my life since childhood. I remember gripping the counter until my knuckles turned white, the paper trembling in my other hand. How do you process the fact that your own parents, people who were supposed to nurture and protect you, see you not as a daughter, but as collateral? I wanted to scream, to throw the papers into the sink, to call them immediately and demand answers. Instead, I forced myself to breathe. I knew instinctively that any rash reaction would only feed into their strategy. What stung most wasn't just the betrayal, but the audacity. They had watched me work 3 jobs in college, sleep on floors, skip meals, patch my life together with grit. They had given my sister tuition allowances, even a luxury wedding, while telling me, "You're independent. You'll figure it out." And now, when I finally had something solid, they were circling like vultures to snatch it away. As I sank into a chair, staring at the lawsuit, a thought crystallized. Maybe this was the moment my whole life had been building toward. A reckoning. For years, I had been too compliant, too eager to keep the peace. But this was a line they had crossed so far, it almost burned the bridge behind them. And before I tell you how I fought back and what it cost me, I want to pause. Because stories like mine aren't rare. Many of you out there have been cornered by family expectations, pressured to sacrifice the very things you worked hardest for. If you've ever had to fight for what's rightfully yours, you know that mix of heartbreak and fury. Before I continue, let me ask you this: where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. And if you've ever been forced to choose between family loyalty and your own survival, hit subscribe, because you're not alone in this. That night I didn't sleep. I read the documents over and over, my eyes catching on phrases like verbal agreement, an obligation of kinship words twisted into weapons against me. My parents thought they had cornered me, but deep inside something shifted. If they wanted a fight, they were about to see a version of me they had never reckoned with before. The papers on my kitchen table stared back at me like a threat I couldn't escape. But even as my pulse hammered, memories started rushing in, memories that explained exactly why my parents felt so entitled to what was mine. I was born 3 years before my sister, and those early years were the only time I ever remember being the center of attention. Once she arrived, everything shifted. Family photo albums still tell the story better than words. My sister always at the center, dressed in new clothes, beaming with our parents. Me off to the side, sometimes even half cut out of the frame. It wasn't overt cruelty, it was the quiet, relentless favoritism that etched itself into the background of every moment. When my science project collapsed because she had accidentally broken it the night before it was due, my parents told me to be more understanding. When she stole my sweater, stained it, and returned it ruined, I was told to be generous. I learned early that my role was to bend to accommodate, to be the good example. She was allowed to be reckless, I was expected to be responsible. The imbalance followed us into our teenage years. I still remember my high school graduation friends of mine got cars, vacations parties that filled backyards. My parents handed me a card with $20 inside. 20. We're saving for your sister's dance competition, they explained without a hint of embarrassment. They'd already started her college fund. Me, I'd have to figure it out because I was so independent. It's funny how those words independent, responsible can be twisted into shackles. They used them to excuse giving her more and me less. They used them to pretend neglect was actually respect. But the truth, it was favoritism dressed up as tough love. I fought my way through college on scholarships and 3 jobs. There were nights I fell asleep over textbooks in the library because I couldn't afford the gas to go back to my off-campus room. My roommate once asked in disbelief, "Your parents don't help at all." And I remember reciting my parents' mantra, "They believe in self-sufficiency." But even then, I knew it rang hollow. Self-sufficiency is noble when it's chosen. When it's forced, it feels like abandonment. Meanwhile, my sister breezed through a private university with a monthly allowance, a meal plan, and parents who wired her money whenever she complained. Over holiday breaks, she bragged about sorority parties, spring break trips to Cancun, shopping sprees in cities I could barely afford to drive through. I sat at the table exhausted, pretending not to hear my own stomach growl as she passed around pictures. And still they adored her. She could stumble lie-fail classes, switch majors 3 times, and she was met with sympathy. I, on the other hand, could ace exams, balance 3 jobs, and land scholarships, and it barely earned a nod. Looking back now, the lawsuit in my kitchen wasn't a shock. It was simply the logical conclusion of a story that had been building for decades. My parents had never believed my victories were mine to keep. To them, my hard work was always communal property, something to be harvested when my sister faltered. That's the hidden cruelty of being cast as the responsible one. You're not celebrated for your strength. You're farmed for it. You're turned into a resource to keep the golden child afloat. And once you realize that once you feel the weight of it, it burns. I don't tell you all this to wallow in self-pity. I tell you because some of you watching right now have lived it too. You've been told to carry everyone else while your own needs were ignored. You've been labeled the strong one, but what that really meant was the disposable one. If you've ever felt like that, if you've ever been pushed into the background so someone else could shine, leave a comment and tell me how you dealt with it. Because your story matters too, and I want to hear it. And if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this journey. Because trust me, it only gets wilder from here. That night, sitting in the glow of the kitchen light, I realized something chilling. I had been trained for this moment. A lifetime of being second had prepared me to fight for myself when no one else would. And while my parents thought their favoritism had broken me, what they didn't know was that it had forged me into steel. The lawsuit wasn't the beginning, it was the boiling point. And as I folded the papers back into their envelope, I knew that for once, I wouldn't play the role they assigned me. For once, I would refuse to be the safety net. College wasn't just hard, it was survival. I enrolled at State University not because it was my dream, but because it offered the best financial aid. Even then, the aid barely scratched the surface. Every morning, I clocked in at the campus coffee shop serving espressos before my 8 a.m. classes. Evenings, I waited tables at a family diner memorizing specials while secretly reviewing my notes between orders. On weekends, I did data entry for the business department. 3 jobs, 7 days a week. Sleep 4 hours on a good night. My roommate Jenna would sometimes find me passed out over my laptop still in my apron from the diner. "Claire," she whispered once, shaking me awake, "your parents really don't help at all." I mumbled the line I'd rehearsed for years. They believe in self-sufficiency. But the words felt empty even then, because I knew self-sufficiency wasn't their belief, it was their excuse. Meanwhile, my sister Emily thrived on an entirely different path. My parents had sent her to an expensive private university, complete with a meal plan, a new car, and a monthly allowance. I'd see her during winter breaks, bursting through the door with shopping bags and stories of sorority formals and spring break trips to Miami. She would laugh, flipping through her photos while I sat quietly at the edge of the couch, too drained to contribute, my hands still sore from carrying trays all weekend. The contrast was stark. While she was buying designer dresses, I was deciding whether I could afford both groceries and gas in the same week. but to my parents none of that mattered. Emily was fragile special, the one who needed their support, and I was independent, the one who would find her way. By the time I graduated, I carried not just student loans, but exhaustion that felt bone deep. Yet despite the fatigue, I was proud. I had done it without them. I thought maybe, just maybe, that pride would be enough. Landing my first job at a financial firm in Chicago was a turning point. The pay was modest, but it was steady. I moved into a cramped studio apartment with secondhand furniture, the kind where the couch wobbled if you sat down too hard. I brought lunch from home every day, peanut butter sandwiches, leftovers wrapped in foil, while my coworkers ordered sushi and cocktails. They thought I was antisocial because I skipped happy hours, but the truth was, I was saving every dollar for something bigger. My goal wasn't vacations or gadgets. It was home ownership, something stable, something mine. For 5 years, I lived frugally, turning down every temptation. When friends traveled, I stayed home. When sales hit the mall, I walked by. When my shoes wore out, I patched them instead of replacing them. It wasn't glamorous, but every sacrifice had a purpose. At 28, the day came. I signed the papers for a one-bedroom apartment in a Chicago neighborhood that wasn't fancy but safe enough. I remember sliding the keys into my pocket, my hands trembling. For the first time in my life, I felt an overwhelming surge of pride. No one had handed me this. No one could take credit. This was mine. Of course the apartment needed work. The kitchen looked like a relic from the 1980s with peeling linoleum and cabinets that barely closed. The carpet was worn thin, the bathroom tiles cracked. But to me, it was a canvas. Nights after work, I watched YouTube tutorials learning to tile, paint, and patch. Weekends were spent covered in dust, scraping, sanding, replacing fixtures I found on clearance. With each improvement, the space transformed not just into a home, but into proof of my persistence. Every brushstroke on the walls was a declaration: I built this life, I earned it, and I clung to that truth even when my parents dismissed it as just an apartment. They didn't understand it wasn't about the square footage. It was about finally having something they hadn't touched, something free of their control. Meanwhile, Emily's life spun in a different direction. She drifted from one job to another, never lasting more than 6 months. The work environment was toxic, she complained, or my boss didn't appreciate me. Each time she quit, my parents nodded sympathetically, their wallets wide open. She never had to face the nights I did bone-tired and broke, praying my paycheck cleared before rent was due. I told myself it didn't matter that our lives were separate, that her chaos was no longer my burden. But I should have known better. In my family, Emily's mistakes were always a storm that eventually swept across my sky. And when she met a wealthy banker named Ryan and my parents drained their retirement for her wedding, I dared to hope that maybe finally she was settled, that maybe finally I could live in peace. But deep down I knew storms don't end just because you hope they will. The wedding should have been a celebration. Instead, it became the opening act of a storm that would sweep me right back into the chaos I'd worked so hard to escape. Emily's engagement to Ryan was treated like a royal announcement in my family. My parents were ecstatic, glowing, gushing, living every moment as if it were their own triumph. When I arrived home for the engagement dinner, I was met not with warmth, but with thinly veiled comparisons. "Claire," my mother sighed as she hugged me stiffly, "you really should think about settling down. Emily's found such a wonderful match. A banker, can you imagine?" I forced a smile. What I imagined was the cost. And sure enough, a week later, I overheard my parents discussing how they were dipping into their retirement savings to cover the reception. "It's an investment," my father said firmly. "Ryan's family will see how dedicated we are." Investment. That word burned. When I had asked for help with tuition years before, I was told to take out loans. But Emily's wedding, that was worth mortgaging their future. On the day of the wedding, everything gleamed: lavish floral arrangements, crystal chandeliers, a string quartet playing as guests sipped champagne. My parents beamed as if the spectacle itself proved their worth. And for Emily, it wasn't enough. She floated around the ballroom, demanding last-minute changes, snapping at servers, reveling in the spotlight. I stood in the corner watching the extravagance unfold, trying to quiet the knot in my stomach. This wasn't my world. It never had been. But then came the whispers. A few months later, Emily called me in tears, saying Ryan wasn't the man she thought. He's controlling Claire. He tracks my spending questions, everything. My gut clenched, but I wasn't surprised. Ryan had always carried himself with an arrogance that made my skin crawl. Still, my parents rushed to her side. "We'll help you," my mother assured her. "We'll fix this." And how did they plan to fix it? By siphoning money again, this time from accounts they had no right to touch. That's when my name came up. They saw my stability as their safety net. The life I had built through sacrifice was in their eyes, not mine to keep. It was a reservoir for Emily's emergencies. When she and Ryan separated, my parents sat me down in their living room, voices low and urgent. "Claire, your sister needs a fresh start. She deserves a home of her own. You have 2 bedrooms, surely you can let her move in for a while." I stared at them, stunned. My apartment was 1 bedroom, 1. And even if it hadn't been, the request wasn't about space. It was about control. "No," I said flatly. "I worked for that apartment. It's my home." My father's jaw tightened. "Family comes first." Funny, I shot back, because it never did when I needed you. The silence that followed was heavy, brittle. For the first time, I didn't bend. For the first time, I said no. They didn't take it well. Calls started flooding in. Pleas turned into guilt trips. "Do you want your sister on the street after everything we've done for you?" And when guilt failed, threats followed. They hinted at legal options, claiming Emily had a right to family property she had never lifted a finger to earn. That was the moment I understood the wedding wasn't just a lavish mistake. It was a turning point. My parents had spent their lives propping Emily up, and now they were determined to make me pay the price. And as much as I wanted to believe their favoritism couldn't touch me anymore, the papers that would later arrive on my kitchen table, the lawsuit with my name stamped across the top, proved just how wrong I was. But in that moment, standing in my parents' living room, I made a decision that would change everything. I would no longer be their resource. I would no longer play the role of the responsible daughter who sacrifices everything. That single word "no" wasn't just a refusal. It was the first crack in the foundation of their control. And sometimes the smallest crack is all it takes for an entire facade to crumble. The lawsuit arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, tucked neatly between grocery flyers and utility bills. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. My hands trembled as I slid the envelope open, the words blurring on the page: Plaintiff Emily Parker, Defendant Claire Parker. I sank into my couch, the one I'd bought secondhand, and reupholstered myself, and read it again, slower this time. Emily was suing me, her own sister, for what she claimed was her share of my apartment. The apartment I had scraped, starved, and sacrificed to buy. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. How could she believe she had any right to what I had built? But then I remembered the years of conditioning. The way my parents had always twisted reality, framing Emily as fragile, entitled to more, and me as independent and capable enough to survive on less. That night I barely slept. My apartment, once my sanctuary, now felt like a cage. I kept replaying memories, painting the walls, fixing the tiles, saving every dollar, and now all of it was being reduced to evidence in a courtroom. The first court hearing was surreal. Emily sat across from me, perfectly composed in a tailored blazer, my parents flanking her like bodyguards. They wouldn't even look at me. When the judge asked her to state her claim, she leaned forward, voice steady. "My sister has benefited disproportionately from family resources," she said. "I deserve my fair share." I almost choked. Family resources. What resources they had given her? Everything: cars, tuition allowances, a wedding fit for royalty, while I had clawed my way through life alone. And now she had the audacity to suggest that my apartment, the only thing I had ever truly owned, was somehow hers too. The judge's eyes flicked toward me. "Ms. Parker, how do you respond?" I rose, slowly gripping the table to steady myself. "Your Honor." I began, my voice tighter than I wanted. "My sister has never contributed a cent toward my apartment. Every dollar came from my own earnings, my own sacrifices. This lawsuit isn't about fairness. It's about entitlement." Emily's lawyer objected, claiming I was emotional. And maybe I was. But who wouldn't be standing across from your own flesh and blood in a courtroom, fighting to prove that the life you built was rightfully yours? Outside the courthouse, reporters lingered. Apparently, lawsuits between siblings over property were juicy enough for headlines. One shoved a microphone toward me, asking, "Do you think this is just a family drama gone too far?" Family drama. The words stung. Because for me, this wasn't drama. It was my life, my home, my freedom. At work, whispers spread. Colleagues who once admired my discipline now eyed me with thinly veiled curiosity. "I saw something about you online," one muttered in the break room. I wanted to disappear, but I couldn't. I had to keep showing up, keep earning because I couldn't afford to lose. During those weeks, my phone buzzed endlessly. My parents left voicemails alternating between begging and berating. "Claire, just settle. Give her something. Don't drag this out." When I didn't respond, my father's tone sharpened. "You're tearing this family apart." But the truth was the family had been fractured long before the lawsuit. This was just the final crack surfacing. One night, exhausted, I sat by my window, staring out at the city lights. The question circled in my mind. Should I settle? Would it be easier to give Emily something, anything, just to make this nightmare end? But then I remembered the years of silence, of being overlooked, of swallowing my pride, while they poured everything into her. I remembered the blisters on my hands from scrubbing old tile, the nights I went to bed hungry, the rejection letters I turned into fuel. No, this wasn't just about an apartment. It was about finally standing my ground. Still, doubt gnawed at me. The law wasn't always fair. Judges could be swayed, evidence could be twisted, and if I lost, it wouldn't just be the apartment I'd lose, it would be proof that my sacrifices meant nothing. That fear haunted me as the case moved forward. Yet beneath it all, a new strength began to take root. For the first time, I wasn't running or bending or sacrificing. I was fighting. And though the battle was far from over, one truth echoed louder than the rest. If I surrendered now, I'd be handing them my life. So I clenched my jaw, squared my shoulders, and prepared for the war my own family had declared against me. The second court session cut deeper than I expected. If the first had been a shock, the second was a full assault. Emily came armed not just with her lawyer, but with carefully curated stories designed to paint me as selfish, ungrateful, even cruel. "She always thought she was better than us," Emily declared to the judge, her voice quivering just enough to appear fragile. She distanced herself, she refused to help with family obligations, and now she's trying to shut me out when all I want is what's fair. I clenched my fists under the table. Fair. That word again. A word they twisted until it became unrecognizable. My parents were called to testify, and I still wasn't prepared for the venom in their voices. My mother, usually so careful with her image, didn't hesitate. Claire was always the difficult one. We poured ourselves into both girls, but she never appreciated it. Emily, on the other hand, has been left vulnerable. The judge nodded, jotting notes. My heart hammered in my chest. Vulnerable Emily had been spoon-fed her entire life. She'd never faced a bill she couldn't shove onto someone else. And now they were dressing her up as a victim while I was recast as the villain. When it was my turn to speak, my lawyer guided me with gentle nods. I told the truth. I explained the sacrifices, the loans, the extra shifts, the nights when I patched broken tiles with my own hands. I described the silence when I needed help, contrasted with the fanfare showered on Emily. But the damage was done. Words hung heavy in the air, and I could sense the room shifting against me. Outside, the tension didn't end. Reporters again clustered by the courthouse steps, one shouting, "Claire, do you regret not reconciling with your family before this went public?" Regret, I wanted to scream. Did they ask Emily if she regretted dragging me here? Did they ask my parents if they regretted choosing sides so openly? That night, I collapsed on my couch, phone buzzing beside me. One message stood out among the flood. "Claire, you're making a fool of yourself. Just give her something so this can end." It was from my father. My chest tightened. I typed out a dozen replies, angry, sarcastic, heartbroken, but deleted each one. Finally, I tossed the phone aside and whispered to myself, "I'm not the fool. I'm the line they can't cross anymore." Still, the weight of it all pressed down. At work, I could feel eyes on me. At the grocery store, I overheard two strangers murmuring about that sister lawsuit. My name wasn't just in court records now, it was gossip entertainment fuel for judgmental whispers. One evening, my neighbor, Mrs. Anderson, knocked on my door with a casserole. "I read about your case," she said softly. "Don't let them scare you, Claire. People like that thrive when you give in. Stand tall." Her kindness cracked something in me. I hadn't realized how starved I was for support until that moment. Not everyone saw me as the villain. Not everyone believed Emily's performance. And yet the fear lingered. What if the judge ruled against me? What if after everything Emily took the one place I called home? That night, I stared at the ceiling, insomnia wrapping around me like chains. My lawyer's words replayed in my mind. The law is on your side, but courts can be unpredictable. You need to prepare for every outcome. Every outcome, even losing. The thought made me nauseous. Losing meant erasure. It meant every scar, every sacrifice, every lonely night had been for nothing. But then another thought rose clearer, sharper. Losing didn't mean surrendering. Even if the court turned against me, I still had my voice, my story, my truth. And maybe, just maybe, sharing that truth would expose the cracks in Emily's performance. I realized then that this fight wasn't just about property papers or family ties. It was about identity, who I was allowed to be. Whether I was destined to remain the overlooked, dismissed daughter, or if I could finally truly stand as my own person. And as I drifted into restless sleep, one conviction rooted itself in me. I wasn't just defending an apartment. I was defending my right to exist without their chains. Tell me in the comments, if you were in my shoes, would you fight or would you walk away? The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm of hearings, depositions, and sleepless nights. Each day I woke up with a pit in my stomach, knowing I was walking into another battlefield. But strangely, with each blow my family dealt me, my skin grew tougher. One morning, my lawyer slid a folder across the table. "Claire, you should see this," she said quietly. Inside were financial records, bank transfers from my parents to Emily that spanned years. Tens of thousands of dollars for tuition, cars, vacations, even her down payment on a failed boutique. Meanwhile, I had worked double shifts scrubbing dishes and cleaning offices just to keep afloat. "Do you want to use this?" my lawyer asked. Part of me hesitated. These were my parents. Exposing them in court felt like burning the last fragile thread between us. But then I remembered their testimony, the venom in their voices as they painted me as ungrateful. They had chosen to turn me into their scapegoat. Why was I still protecting them? Ding. "Yes," I said finally. "Bring it forward." The next hearing was explosive. My lawyer presented the documents, laying out a timeline of favoritism so blatant the courtroom murmured in shock. Emily's lawyer tried to object, claiming it was irrelevant. But the judge leaned forward, brows furrowed, and asked Emily directly, "Did you or did you not receive these transfers?" Emily shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, but it was support. Family support." "And did your sister receive comparable support?" the judge pressed. Emily's silence was answer enough. For the first time, I saw her mask slip. Her confidence cracked, if only for a moment. And in that moment, I realized something vital: she wasn't invincible. Afterward, I stepped outside the cold air, filling my lungs like a cleansing tide. Reporters swarmed again, but this time their questions had a different edge. "Claire, do you feel vindicated by the evidence?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wanted my silence to speak louder than any words. Let them see that I wasn't just a defendant. I was someone who refused to be erased. That night I allowed myself something I hadn't felt in months: hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth was strong enough to cut through the lies. Still, my parents didn't relent. Another voicemail arrived, dripping with fury. "How dare you drag our finances into this? Do you know how humiliated we are?" I listened once, then deleted it. For years, their disappointment had crushed me. But now their disapproval was proof I was finally standing apart. At work, a colleague slipped a note onto my desk. "Stay strong. They can't rewrite your story." I folded it carefully and tucked it into my wallet. Little reminders like that became my armor. The trial wasn't over. Emily and her lawyer regrouped, spinning new narratives, painting me as vindictive. But I had crossed a line inside myself. I was no longer playing defense. I was fighting back. Every night I reviewed documents, wrote down memories, pieced together the long history of being overlooked. Each detail sharpened my resolve. They had underestimated me. They thought I would fold under the weight of their accusations. But the more they pressed, the more I realized I was no longer afraid of losing them. Because the truth was, I had already lost them years ago. The next morning, I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, but because my reflection no longer carried the same fear. My shoulders were squared, my eyes steady. For the first time, I whispered the words I had been too afraid to believe: "I'm not their victim anymore." And deep down, I knew this fight wasn't just mine. It was for anyone who had ever been told to shrink, to surrender, to hand over what they worked for, because family demanded it. So I squared my jaw, gathered my files, and walked back into the storm. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was my rebirth. The courtroom became a stage, and Emily was still determined to be the star. After the evidence of financial favoritism shook her facade, she doubled down, weaving more elaborate tales of her supposed suffering. She always wanted to see me fail. Emily sniffled before the judge, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. When I tried to open my boutique, she mocked me. When I struggled, she laughed. And now she's trying to take everything from me. Her words stung, not because they were true, but because they were delivered with such conviction that a stranger might believe them. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, reminding myself to breathe. I wasn't here to argue feelings. I was here for facts. My lawyer leaned in, whispering, "Stay steady. Her performance is cracking. Don't interrupt. The judge is noticing." So I stayed silent. And in that silence, I realized something powerful. Not every battle needed my voice. Sometimes restraint was louder. Then came my turn. My lawyer projected photos on the screen, images of the apartment I had spent years repairing with my own hands. Broken tiles, replaced cabinets, refinished leaks, patched. Every corner bore my fingerprints, my sweat, my sacrifices. "This isn't just property," my lawyer argued. "It's a life Claire built when no one else stood beside her." And while her sister enjoyed financial gifts, Claire built her independence from the ground up. The judge's gaze shifted between the photos and Emily, who avoided eye contact. Outside the courtroom, the press frenzy grew. Headlines swirled: "Sisters at war, family ties shattered in property battle." My inbox filled with messages, some supportive, some cruel. Strangers felt entitled to judge a story they only knew in fragments. One evening, scrolling through the noise, I found a comment that pierced me. She should have just given her sister something. It's not worth the drama. For a moment, I almost believed it. Was I dragging this out unnecessarily? Could I have walked away and spared myself the agony? But then a memory rose me years ago, scrubbing floors late into the night. My body aching, my dreams dimming because I had no one to help. Emily was never there. My parents weren't there. Only I was. Why should I hand over my hard work to someone who never lifted a finger? That thought anchored me. Still, the weight of the fight seeped into every corner of my life. At the grocery store, whispers followed me. At work, colleagues lowered their voices when I entered the room. I wasn't Claire the woman anymore. I was Claire the lawsuit. And yet, in the midst of the suffocating tension, glimmers of light appeared. A stranger sent me a handwritten letter. I went through something similar. "Don't give up. Your story matters." I held that letter to my chest and cried for the first time, not from despair, but from the reminder that I wasn't alone. The hearings dragged on, but my resolve sharpened. Each time Emily spun another lie, I countered with evidence. Each time my parents whispered poison, I stood taller. The storm was fierce, but I was learning to dance in the rain. One night, I looked out my apartment window, the city lights flickering like stars, and whispered to myself, "This isn't about winning anymore. It's about not disappearing." I realized then that Emily's true weapon wasn't the lawsuit. It was the hope that I would crumble under shame, under exhaustion, under loneliness. But I wouldn't, because every bruise she left, every cut my parents inflicted, became another layer of armor. And if I had to walk through fire to protect the life I built, then so be it. This wasn't just a courtroom drama anymore. It was a declaration: I will not be erased. By the time the third month of hearings rolled around, the tension in the courtroom had reached a breaking point. Every session felt like a new ambush. Emily with her crocodile tears, my parents glaring at me from the gallery, and reporters scribbling down every word like it was scripture. But then something happened that shifted everything. My lawyer and I had been digging deeper, combing through years of paperwork, when we stumbled on a detail that made my stomach flip. A second set of deeds, hidden, tucked away in county records that Emily clearly thought no one would ever bother to look at. The document showed an attempted transfer of my apartment, signed not by me, but by Emily months before she even filed the lawsuit. Her plan wasn't just to claim it through court. She had already tried to steal it outright. When I saw her forged signature, I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I traced the lines on the page. It wasn't just betrayal, it was proof that all her speeches about family fairness were a mask. She wasn't fighting for justice. She was fighting because she wanted to erase me, wipe away every shred of what I had worked for. "Claire," my lawyer whispered, "this changes everything. But you need to be ready. If we drop this bomb in court, it's going to explode." I nodded. I was ready for the explosion. The next hearing, my lawyer presented the evidence. The room erupted. Emily's lawyer objected furiously, but the judge demanded silence. All eyes turned to Emily as the forged document was projected on the screen. Emily's face drained of color. She stammered, denying it, blaming clerical errors, even suggesting I had planted the paperwork myself. But the judge wasn't buying it. "This is a serious matter," he said gravely. "Forgery is a crime." In that instant, I saw the tide shift. For months, I had been painted as the aggressor, the bitter sister, the ungrateful daughter. But now Emily stood exposed, not as a victim, but as a manipulator willing to cross any line. And yet, part of me ached. This was my sister. The same girl I had once braided hair with before school, the same girl I had whispered secrets to late at night. Now she was cornered, her mask ripped off, and I couldn't recognize her anymore. But the ache didn't stop me from feeling a spark of triumph. For once, the truth had the upper hand. Outside, reporters shouted questions. "Claire, do you think Emily committed fraud?" I didn't answer. Instead, I said something else, something raw and real. Families aren't always what they seem. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who cut the deepest. That quote made headlines. And strangely, it gave me power. Because it was no longer just about my story, it was about a universal truth. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with what would happen next. Would Emily face charges? Would the judge throw out her case entirely? Or would she find yet another way to twist the knife? I didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at me. But one thing was certain: we were approaching the breaking point. This wasn't going to drag on much longer. Something, whether it was justice or destruction, was about to come crashing down. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the crash, because I knew that when the dust settled, I would still be standing. And if you followed me this far, don't go anywhere. Because what came next was darker, more shocking, and more life-changing than anything I could have imagined. The days after the forgery reveal were a blur. For the first time, the courtroom didn't feel like it was strangling me. It felt like air was finally moving in my favor. But Emily wasn't finished. She came back sharper, her voice dripping with venom. She forged my name. She screamed at the judge, her hands trembling as if she was the wronged party. She wants to destroy me, and now she's planting fake papers to make me look guilty. It was desperate, reckless, and everyone in the room knew it. But desperation can be dangerous. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't fighting to win anymore. She was fighting to take me down, even if it meant setting herself on fire. My parents only fueled the flames. One night, I got a call from my mother. Her voice was cold like metal. "You've humiliated your sister," she hissed. "Do you feel proud? Whatever happens, Claire, you're still the disgrace of this family. And if this goes to the papers, we'll make sure you regret it." Her words cut deeper than I expected. For years, I had prayed for their approval, begged for scraps of love. Now, hearing her declare war against me, it was like watching a bridge burn that I'd spent my whole life trying to cross. But instead of collapsing, I felt steel rising inside me. Their threats weren't my chains anymore. They were proof that I had finally broken free. Still, the toll was heavy. My job performance slipped. I'd sit at my desk staring blankly at spreadsheets, unable to focus. Friends stopped inviting me out. They didn't know what to say, how to comfort someone whose face was plastered across tabloids under headlines like "Sister versus Sister, a family torn apart." It was lonely, crushingly lonely. But then a crack of light. My neighbor, Mrs. Harris, a widowed woman in her 70s, knocked on my door one evening with a casserole dish in her hands. "I read the papers," she said gently. "And I just want you to know, sometimes blood isn't family. Sometimes family is who shows up with food when you're too tired to cook." I cried into her shoulder that night, realizing how long it had been since anyone simply showed up for me. That small act reminded me even in betrayal, kindness can find you. Back in court, my lawyer pressed harder. He demanded a handwriting analysis on the deed. The results came back clear: the forgery was Emily's. She had signed my name in an attempt to steal what wasn't hers. The judge's patience snapped. "If these accusations continue, Ms. Emily," he said sternly, "you may face criminal charges. This is no longer a property dispute. This is fraud." The look on Emily's face was unforgettable shock, rage, and a flicker of fear. She wasn't untouchable anymore, and yet instead of surrender, she spiraled further. The next day, I woke up to find my car keyed from bumper to bumper. A note under the windshield wiper read, "Traitors don't deserve comfort." I never proved it was Emily, but I didn't need proof. I knew. The war had spilled beyond the courtroom into every corner of my life. And even as her lies collapsed under evidence, her fury only grew. But so did my determination. Because at that point, it was no longer just about the apartment. It was about survival. It was about standing up and saying, I will not be bullied into silence, not by her, not by them, not by anyone. I had spent years shrinking, apologizing for existing, begging for their crumbs of approval. But now I was done begging. If Emily wanted a war, I would give her one. But it would be fought on truth, not lies, on proof, not pity. And as I walked out of the courthouse that day, cameras, flashing microphones shoved in my face, I said only one thing. This fight isn't about property anymore, it's about freedom, and I won't stop until I have it. The words weren't planned. They came from the deepest place in me. And when I saw the clip later on the evening news, I realized something powerful. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was a story for anyone who had ever been cornered, gaslit, or betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect them. And that story was far from over. By the time the fourth month of hearings began, I could feel the finish line somewhere ahead, but it was jagged, unpredictable, and lined with traps. Emily wasn't retreating. She was reinventing her attacks. One morning, I arrived at the courthouse to find reporters swarming the steps. They weren't there for me, they were there for a leak. Someone and I had no doubt who had given the press copies of private texts I had sent years ago during a low point in my life. Messages where I admitted feeling like I didn't belong in my family. Messages where I confessed to depression and doubts about my worth. Headlines screamed, Claire admits she felt unstable, can she be trusted? Standing on those courthouse steps, my shame surged like a wave ready to drown me. It was one thing for Emily to attack my rights. It was another for her to strip me bare in front of the world, reducing my pain to a weapon. Inside, she sat smugly like a queen on her throne. Her lawyer hinted that someone mentally unstable shouldn't be trusted with property or independence. My fists clenched, nails biting into my palms. For the first time, I truly wondered if I had the strength to see this through. But then I remembered the forged deed. I remembered the neighbor who showed up with food. I remembered every insult my mother had whispered down the phone every time I was told I was less than. And something inside me broke open. I stood shaking but steady and asked the judge if I could speak. Your Honor. I began, my voice low but carrying, I won't deny those texts. I wrote them. I was in pain. But pain doesn't make me unworthy. It makes me human. And if my sister wants to drag my lowest moments into the light, then let them shine because those moments made me stronger. And I refuse to be erased for surviving them. For a second silence. Then the judge nodded. The reporters scribbled furiously. Emily looked rattled, her smirk faltering. That speech didn't just defend me in court, it reclaimed me. Still, the battles wore on. Legal fees stacked higher than my paycheck, and I started selling off small possessions just to cover the bills. A gold bracelet from my grandmother, my bike, even my couch. I lived in an apartment half empty, but strangely, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like shedding weight I no longer needed. The turning point came during cross-examination. Emily had been called to testify, and my lawyer pressed hard on the forgery. He laid the documents side by side, asked her to explain the inconsistencies, the handwriting match, the timing. Her answers cracked under pressure. I don't know, I don't remember, maybe Claire did it. The judge's brow furrowed deeper with every word. And then in a rare moment of open frustration, he said, Ms. Emily, the court is not blind. What I see here is an attempt to deceive this process. This behavior will not be tolerated. The gavel struck. I exhaled for the first time in weeks. But Emily wasn't finished outside the courtroom. That evening, I found a letter shoved under my door. No return address, no signature. Just scrawled words. If you don't drop this case, you'll regret it in ways the court can't save you from. My hand shook as I held it. For a moment, fear crawled up my spine. But then clarity. This wasn't strength, it was desperation. Emily was unraveling. And instead of breaking me, the threat lit a fire. I called my lawyer, reported the harassment, and prepared myself for the final stretch. Because I realized something vital, I had already lost my family's love, my comfort, my sense of belonging. There was nothing left for them to take except my freedom, and that was the one thing I swore they would never get. Walking back into court the next morning, I felt the cameras flash against my skin like lightning, but this time I didn't flinch. I lifted my chin, looked straight into the lenses, and thought, this isn't the story of my collapse. This is the story of my rise. The courthouse buzzed with a strange energy the morning of the final hearings. Reporters were thick on the steps more than usual, their cameras already raised as if they knew today would bring fireworks. Inside, my lawyer whispered that this could be the day the judge ruled, but a gnawing instinct told me Emily wasn't going down quietly. And I was right. As the proceedings began, Emily's attorney stood with a new folder in his hands, his expression far too smug. "Your Honor," he said, "we have discovered new evidence, a second deed hidden in a safety deposit box, which we believe proves our client's rightful ownership." The courtroom gasped. My chest tightened. Another deed after everything. The judge's eyes narrowed. He ordered the document presented. And there it was laid flat on the table, a clean, polished deed with my father's supposed signature, naming Emily as sole inheritor. My lawyer shot me a look equal parts furious and alarmed. We both knew what this was, another forgery. Another attempt to twist reality in her favor, but this one was slicker, more professional. Whoever helped her draft it knew the stakes. The judge allowed recess so both sides could examine the document. During that break, I sat alone on a hard wooden bench, my hands trembling. For a brief, terrifying moment, I imagined losing. I imagined Emily smiling as the judge handed her the keys, imagined packing the last of my things into boxes, imagined walking out into a city that already thought I was unstable and unworthy. And in that darkness, I remembered something important. I had survived every trick she had thrown so far. The fake deed, the tabloids, the threats. And now this just another storm. I breathed deep and I decided right there, no more fear, no more shrinking. When the judge reconvened, my lawyer stood. "Your Honor, we request immediate forensic analysis. We've already seen one forgery in this courtroom, and we believe this so-called discovery is nothing more than a desperate attempt to delay justice." The judge agreed. The deed was sent to analysis. And once again I saw the faint crack in Emily's armor, the twitch of her mouth, the way she shifted in her chair. She knew. She was playing with fire. The delay gave me time, though. Time to reflect on just how far this had gone. I thought back to my childhood bedroom in that same apartment, the pink wallpaper I'd begged for at age 10, the tiny desk where I'd done homework by lamplight. That home wasn't just property, it was memory foundation survival. Emily wasn't just trying to take walls and windows. She was trying to erase my past. And something in me hardened. So when the judge asked if I had anything to say before adjournment, I stood. "Your Honor," I said steady. "I've been accused, shamed, and dragged through the mud for months. My sister has brought forward documents that have already been proven false. And now another one appears conveniently, just as the case nears its conclusion. This is not just about property. This is about truth. And I will stand here as long as it takes to make sure it is seen." The room went silent. Even the reporters leaned forward. Emily glared at me with eyes sharp as knives, but for once I didn't flinch. And that's when the thought struck me, a whisper of strategy that felt almost like fate. If Emily had another forgery tucked away, how many more were there? And what if someone outside our family had helped her craft them? That suspicion, that tiny thread, would change everything. As the hearing closed for the day, my lawyer leaned close. "Claire," he murmured, "we're close. But there's something bigger here. Don't be surprised if what comes next doesn't just expose Emily, but the people behind her." And with that, I knew the storm wasn't over. It was only gathering. Because the truth once cornered doesn't stay hidden forever. It fights back. The next morning, the courthouse felt like a pressure cooker. The press had doubled, maybe tripled, lining the steps and cramming the hallway outside the courtroom. Everyone smelled blood in the water. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore, it had become a public spectacle. Emily walked in first, draped in designer black, her hair perfectly styled as if she were attending a gala instead of a trial. She glanced at me with a smile that was all teeth. To her, this wasn't about justice, it was theater, and she believed she was the star. But I had something she didn't know. The forensic analysis of her second deed had come back overnight, and my lawyer had a copy in his hands. As the session opened, he requested permission to present. The judge nodded. "Your Honor," my lawyer said, his voice steady, but charged, "we had this deed examined by 3 independent experts. All 3 confirmed what we suspected. The ink was modern, the paper mismatched to the era, and the signature, though clever, was traced. This document is a forgery, just like the first." The words hung in the air. Then came the explosion. Reporters scrambled for notes. Cameras clicked. And Emily. her perfect mask cracked. She leaned forward, her lips moving furiously as she whispered at her attorney, her face flushing crimson. But the judge wasn't finished. He looked directly at her. "Ms. Emily, this court has now seen not one but two fraudulent documents tied to your name. This is a serious matter. If you cannot present honest evidence, the court will view this as a deliberate attempt to obstruct justice." For once, Emily didn't smirk. She paled. I should have felt triumphant in that moment, but instead, my chest ached. This was my sister, my own blood. And yet she had sunk so deep into greed and malice that she'd risk prison to erase me. Still, the fight wasn't over. The judge recessed again, but before the gavel even struck, Emily erupted. "She's lying," she shouted, pointing straight at me. "She's the manipulator. She forged those papers herself. You don't know her like I do. She's always been unstable." Gasps rippled through the room. For a heartbeat, I froze. And then something inside me sharpened. I rose slowly. "Your Honor." I said, my voice shaking but growing steadier with every word. "My sister has called me unstable, unworthy, and now a forger. But here's the truth. Every accusation she throws is another piece of herself she's projecting. Because only someone desperate and guilty would scream lies in a courtroom instead of offering proof." The room stilled. Emily glared daggers, but I didn't look away. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about the apartment anymore. It wasn't about furniture walls or inheritance. It was about power. Emily needed to control the narrative, to paint me as weak so she could stand taller. And by standing here refusing to fold, I had already won something she could never reclaim: my voice. As I sat back down, the reporter's eyes locked onto me. Some even nodded subtly, like they understood. For the first time, the story was shifting. But the real twist was yet to come. That evening, as I left the courthouse, a man in a gray suit approached me. His face was tense, his steps hurried. He introduced himself as an employee at the law firm Emily had hired. And then he handed me an envelope. Inside were copies of emails between Emily and one of her lawyers. Emails that discussed fabricating documents, coaching her testimony, even strategies to smear me in the press. It wasn't just Emily anymore. She had collaborators. And suddenly I realized this case could topple more than my sister. It could expose corruption in a law firm, maybe even shake the very system she thought protected her. As I stared at the papers, one thought surged through me. The endgame is here. The revelation of the emails hit like a bomb. I sat in my apartment that evening, the envelope shaking in my hands as I reread every line. Emily hadn't just fabricated deeds or lied in court. She had orchestrated a campaign of deception, enlisting her lawyer to coach her, manipulate witnesses, and even leak selective information to the press. My own family had been complicit in building a narrative to make me look unreasonable, selfish, and unstable. I felt my stomach churn, a mix of rage and disbelief. How could my parents do this? They had raised me, fed me, taught me to be responsible, and yet they had allowed this. Or worse, they had encouraged it. All their past favoritism, all the whispered words of "Emily needs you" more suddenly made sense. I had been groomed to be the sacrificial one, the safety net, the eternal backup. Every late-night shift, every sleepless semester, every penny I saved, they had counted on it, silently banking it for her failures. But this deliberate, systematic attempt to destroy my life was the final straw. The person who had once felt powerless began to feel the first stirrings of unstoppable strength. I called my lawyer immediately. "Elena," I said, my voice tight with controlled fury. "These emails, this proves more than fraud. It proves collusion. It proves harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I want every bit of this documented, and I want it used to protect me and finally hold them accountable." Elena didn't hesitate. "Claire, you have more than enough now. This is the leverage we need to ensure the lawsuit is dismissed and the countersuit is airtight. We'll include the emails, the forged deeds, all communications with your family. This establishes a clear pattern of harassment, deceit, and exploitation." For the first time in months, I felt the weight lift slightly from my chest. For years, my family had controlled the narrative. They had painted me as the responsible but ungrateful daughter, the one who was always jealous, always difficult, always willing to bend. But now, finally, the truth was in my hands. The next hearing was electric. The courtroom buzzed as Elena began to present the emails. Each line, each instruction, each suggested manipulation sent a ripple of disbelief through the room. The judge's expression darkened with every page. Emily's lawyer sputtered, objected, tried to discredit the evidence, but the proof was irrefutable. It wasn't just Emily, it was the adults who had enabled her orchestrating a campaign to exploit me, the daughter they had promised to nurture. When it was my turn to speak, I rose slowly, looking directly at the judge and then at my family. Your Honor, my parents and sister have spent decades shaping my life to serve their ends. They treated me as a resource, a safety net, a permanent solution to Emily's failures. They taught her she was entitled to whatever she wanted, and they expected me to comply without question. When I refused, they escalated. They attempted to fabricate documents, manipulate witnesses, and harass me both legally and personally. Today I stand here not just defending my apartment, but defending my life, my autonomy, and my dignity. The courtroom fell silent. Even Emily seemed momentarily stunned, her practiced composure faltering. For the first time, the true depth of her and my parents' actions was visible to everyone. Elena then asked me to provide context. I told the judge about the fraudulent student loans, the invasion of privacy, the threats, the attempts to access my finances. Each revelation painted a picture of deliberate, systematic abuse that had escalated over decades. By the end of the day, the shift was clear. The courtroom, once sympathetic to Emily's tears and my parents' pleas, now leaned unmistakably toward me. The pattern of favoritism, manipulation, and fraud was no longer hidden. The balance of power had tipped decisively in my favor. And as I left the courthouse that evening, I felt something I hadn't in years, a sense of absolute clarity. I was no longer the daughter they had defined me to be. I was not a tool, a safety net, or a shadow behind my sister. I was a woman with a life of her own, a home of her own, and a voice that would not be silenced. I took a deep breath, looking up at the city skyline, and realized something powerful. Standing up to those who betray you is not just about winning a case, it's about reclaiming yourself. And that, I knew, was the ultimate victory. The morning of the final ruling arrived like a storm on the lake, heavy with tension and inevitability. I entered the courthouse dressed in a navy suit, hair neatly pulled back each step, deliberate. Every inch of my being was braced for the moment I had both feared and longed for, the moment my family would finally face the consequences of their actions. Inside the courtroom was electric. Emily sat across from me, eyes darting nervously to the judge. My parents flanked her, rigid with anxiety, whispering counsel I could barely hear. Their faces, once so confident, were now etched with lines of worry and disbelief. Elena leaned over as I settled into my chair. Claire, she whispered, remember, truth is on our side. They have no solid ground. You've built an unshakable case. Today you reclaim more than your apartment, you reclaim your life. The judge entered her presence, commanding silence in an instant. She reviewed the files, glanced up, and said firmly, before proceeding, let me be clear about the situation. The plaintiff has withdrawn the original claim regarding the verbal agreement to sell the apartment. What remains are the countersuit claims: harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, identity theft related to fraudulent student loans, invasion of privacy via private diaries, and trespassing incidents. A rush of relief washed over me. The lawsuit against me was gone. The judge's acknowledgement of our countersuit made the stakes painfully clear. Justice was finally within reach. Elena began methodically presenting the evidence. Each fraudulent loan application, each email, plotting manipulation, each security camera clip, showing my parents attempting to enter my apartment without permission, and the public workplace incident. Everything was laid out in meticulous detail. The judge's expression darkened with every piece of proof. Emily's attorney tried to argue that all actions were taken out of concern for family welfare, but Elena dismantled each claim effortlessly. She presented the student loan records proving forged signatures, the emails revealing attempts to pressure me, and the testimony of my neighbors and friends documenting harassment. The courtroom felt as if the air itself had shifted. The momentum now clearly favored me. Then came the turning point, the financial records Emily's ex-husband, Ryan, provided. Evidence of Emily's extensive gambling debts and personal misconduct during the marriage revealed that my parents' desperation wasn't just about a fair divorce. It was about covering for Emily's financial recklessness. The courtroom collectively held its breath as the implications sank in. My family's narrative of victimhood crumbled entirely. The judge leaned forward, addressing my parents directly. The actions described constitute harassment, fraud, and invasion of privacy. Courts do not look kindly upon attempts to manipulate family and legal systems for personal gain. Finally, the gavel fell. The ruling was in my favor on all counts. My parents were ordered to repay the fraudulent loans with interest, cover my legal fees, and provide damages for emotional distress. A restraining order was issued prohibiting any of them from contacting me at home or work without explicit permission. The judge further referred the student loan fraud to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. My mother's face crumpled in tears. My father sat stunned, and Emily, once so defiant, sat silently, her previous arrogance extinguished. I breathed deeply, the weight of years of manipulation and expectation finally lifting. Outside the courthouse, Elena stood beside me, guiding me through the crowd. Reporters clamored, but I felt detached from it all. For the first time, I wasn't just defending myself. I had reclaimed my autonomy, my dignity, and my right to live without being exploited. And now I can tell you, this true family doesn't demand your sacrifice. It doesn't gaslight you, and it certainly doesn't try to steal your life. Real strength comes from setting boundaries, protecting yourself, and demanding respect, even if it means standing alone. As we walked into the sunlight, I glanced at the courthouse steps, imagining all the people watching, and whispered to myself, I have won more than a legal battle today. I have won my freedom. For anyone who has faced betrayal, exploitation, or favoritism, remember, standing up for yourself is not selfish. It is necessary. And sometimes the most important battles are fought not for others, but for your own soul. If you've been inspired by this story, make sure to check out my next video, where I share the steps I took to rebuild my life and my sense of trust after betrayal. Don't miss it. You might find the courage to stand for yourself too. As the dust settled, I returned to my apartment, the walls echoing with the quiet of my own life. It was the same space I had fought so hard to protect, yet it felt entirely new. Each corner, each surface was a testament, not just to financial independence, but to resilience, to survival, to reclaiming the narrative that had long been stolen from me. The quiet was no longer oppressive, it was a sanctuary. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to breathe without fear. No phone calls to manipulate me, no whispers of obligation, no expectations to sacrifice my peace for others. I could sit on my balcony, watch the city lights flicker, and feel the simple joy of being fully holy myself. This apartment had become more than walls and floors. It was a declaration I had the right to live on my own terms. The road ahead wasn't without reflection. I sought therapy unpacking decades of parental favoritism, manipulation, and the subtle erosion of my self-worth. Each session revealed patterns I had normalized for too long, and slowly I began to rebuild my understanding of what healthy, reciprocal relationships could look like. I reconnected with old friends, forming a chosen family who supported and cherished me for who I am, not for what I could provide. I learned that boundaries are a form of self-respect. Protecting your home, your finances, your emotional space is not selfish, it is essential. I learned that freedom isn't just the absence of external control. It's the ability to say no, to choose, and to thrive despite betrayal. Looking back, the lawsuit, the harassment, and the family betrayal were painful crucibles, but they revealed my strength. I emerged not just victorious in court, but empowered in life. My home, once a battlefield, is now a haven. And every night as I close the door behind me, I am reminded standing up for yourself can feel terrifying, but it can also be the greatest act of love you'll ever give love to yourself. I survived, I thrived, and for the first time I knew peace.